I will tell you, we are live.
Yay! Good evening, everybody. It's to say that Tlhogonolo and I are excited would not, and this is why we often say that English is just so lacking, because it would not adequately put across just how excited we are for today's conversation. We are in the esteemed company of somebody who's potentially written the best debut of 2021. I think the Tlhogonolo and I are quite happy to begin to call it, but I will hand over to the Tlhogonolo to really introduce our guests today, who really, I hope that we are sitting and we are so ready for the amazing company that we are in.
Everyone, hello. I'm not someone who normally doesn't have words. I think I'm able to express myself quite fully. But I was saying to everyone just before we came on, I was like, if I cry during this, conversation, like, please forgive me. As Alma says, like, I think that Robert Jones Jr.'s book, like, does something really incredible. And I actually don't think that we will begin to comprehend what it does for this literary imagination. And so I want to contextualize our conversation today before I read Robert's bio. I had to just bring the queers into the conversation because I think it's so important to think about like what is happening and what we're talking about. And I remember reading through the prophets and returning, and it's interesting because both these books do like a lot of ideological shifts, but in really interesting ways. So I was thinking about No Ashes in the Fire, Coming of Age, Black and Free in America by Darnell Moore. And I wanted to read a little bit about what Darnell says in the introduction of his book, which I think ties really nicely to our conversations about the prophets today. So Darnell writes, "This story is not new, and my story is not unique. Black, queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people in America are bearers of narratives of struggle and triumph, despite the ways intimates and strangers have attempted to force us to silence our sexual desires. Our stories, like our lives, are complex, bountiful, profound, disappointing, hopeful, varied, and often disregarded. We've always been here, Black, queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people, loved and fucked on some racist master's plantation. We wrote theories debunking white racial supremacist ideology. We too were the architects of Black liberation, women justice, anti-war movements, and the Black artist. We are the unnamed Black sisters, brothers, and non-binary people who have lived queer theory before it was popular among these white academia. We are James Baldwin, Jackie Mums Mabel, Richard Bruce Nugent. But, and y'all, and with that, I just want to introduce our author for tonight. Robert Jones Jr. is a writer from New York City. He received BFA in creative writing and MFA in fiction from Brooklyn College. He has written from numerous publications, including the New York Times, Essence, and the Paris Review. He's the creator and curator of the social justice, social commentary community, Son of Baldwin, which has over 230,000 followers across social media. And Robert is also now the author of this wonderful, wonderful book called The Prophets. And we just want to say welcome to the Cheeky Natives, Robert. Welcome.
I must say that this is one of the greatest moments of this entire experience. To speak with my siblings from the continent means more to me than you could ever know. Thank you so much for welcoming me.
Can we just talk about this, right? So I tweeted the other day, I was like, how dare Robert write a beautifully crafted masterpiece? Like, let's start there. Let's just start there, right? So Robert is leaving us with a book where we're like, OMG. What is going on? So, Robert, how dare you write such a masterfully crafted novel? Like, how dare you?
In South Africa, we'd say, "Whomst are you? Whomst are you? Whomst are you?" To audaciously on debut force us to think about memory, about personhood, about intimacy, right? And who is written into and out of the historical record, right? Based on how they look and who they've loved. And how dare you, on debut, just have us snatched. I had to take my wig off while reading this book because
I thank you very much for that. And you know what? In the spirit of the prophets, I never want to take full credit for what you read on that page, because if it were not for Chinua Achebe, Toni Morrison, James Baldwin, Zora Neale Hurston, Phyllis Wheatley, Wallace Thurman, I can go on and on and on with the names of the traditions that I'm writing in, my ancestors who were denied the right to read or write, who survived so that we may all be here. I could not have written this if not for the path that was paved for me, the price that was paid for me, for those who watch over me. I could not have done this. So thank you so much for those kind words. And I thank the ancestors for allowing me to be the vessel through which those words could come.
And I think it's important for us to start here. You speak about, the people who have influenced you or who've created a path to write this book. I find there was quite a lot of that, right? So ode to, literary legends, right? So I find that you think about the spirituals and you think about like the ode to Zora, for instance, and how Zora really encapsulated the essence of the people who grew up in the South, right? And then you speak about the witness and the tenderness, right? Sort of like this gazing. We are allowed into these people's lives because they want us to be there. But at certain moment, we're also away from them because we are gazing into their lives. And it just reminds me of Baldwin, right? This idea of like witnessing, right? And then you think about ancestry, and I think often about Audre Lorde and how like it's important for us to connect there. So I wanted to speak a little bit about, and then you think about the lyricism, right? And we know lyricism, Black folks, Toni Morrison, right? We just know like Toni. And so I want to speak about that. I want to speak about in writing the prophets, how did you draw from all these literary ancestors and how you wanted to, in essence, give ode to them, but also keep Robert Jones Jr. as an essence of writing the prophets?
That is a great question. So any writer who wants to be a better writer than they are at the moment that they're writing should be reading. And for me, it was imperative that I was reading works of Black artists because, as James Baldwin and Toni Morrison talked about, they looked to people like Chinua Achebe in order to be able to write from a Black perspective, absent the white gaze. So we don't care what white people think. We're not going to translate. We're not going to write so that you understand. We are going to write from the Black perspective. And what that means is I have to then understand what the Black perspective is from not just an American point of view, not just Black American, but Black South African, Black Nigerian, Black Brazilian, Black Canadian, Black British. I need to understand all of these varying points of view. So that means that I have to do a lot of reading. And in doing a lot of reading, I also have to then look at each work to see what's happening on the sentence level here. Why is the plot going in this direction? Why is the book structured in this way? And when I do that, then I have to say to myself, so if, for example, Toni Morrison told this book, Beloved, from the point of view of the ghost, the child who was killed, what does that mean? And how does that open up the story? And how does it change it from if she tried to tell this story from a different point of view. So then when I get to writing the prophets, I'm saying, what's the center here? The center here is the love between Samuel and Isaiah, but it's also bigger than that because it's also the love between Kosai and Elewa. And so what does that mean? How do I tell this story? Because now Sarah has to tell me what she knows, and Bianti has to tell me what she knows, and King Akusa has to tell me what she knows, and the ancestors have to tell me what they know. And how do I fit all of that in a way that it's also cohesive and that it's beautiful and that it's honest? That is the most important part, that it is telling the truth. And then that is when you start to say, okay, how do I structure this now? Who can tell me the best way to structure this? And so I went to Toni Morrison's Paradise and Ayanna Mathis's The 12 Tribes of Hattie to look at how they structured these books that are told by from varying points of view so that I can do that. And then I let the ancestors in because they came to me in a dream and gave me a sentence, "You do not yet know us." And so I'm like, oh, I'm being scolded because I thought that I was going to leave them out of this. And they're the ones who are giving me this gift. And so I weave their voices in and realized they want me to also talk about King Akusa and her tribe and Kosei and Alewa. And I have to now do my research for my continental African siblings and how what their histories looked like and what their cultures and languages and loves looked like. And the best place I found to find that was in the oral histories. I went to Esther Arma and heard her talk about how in Ghana, yes, if you asked Ghanaian people, do you have homosexuals? They would say no, because they didn't have a word. They didn't need it. They didn't separate it from heterosexuality. They didn't separate cisgender and transgender. It was all a part of the landscape. It was all love. It was all gender. It was all gender identity, and everybody belonged. Unlike here in the States, where we had to separate it and make it ugly, you know? So all of that came into play when I said, okay, I'm not going to have to say King Akusa is a woman. I'm just going to say King Akusa said this. She said blah, 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 blah. And so many Americans have told me, I had to read that line again because you said king. That's right. Because the African point of view of that is king is just a title. That's it. It's not connected to gender or gender identity. And so once I started to imbibe that sort of thing, it became like second nature to write this book.
Mm. I love that you've said that, because for me, I've read a little bit of historical fiction, and what I always think about is that writing Black historical fiction is complex, right? Because in many ways we write about our history interrupted. So there is a history interrupted that we have to bear witness to.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to know for you what bearing witness has meant in the reimagination of what our history may have looked like had it not been interrupted in the way that it was. And so, I mean, further to add to that is to think of the ways in which you've written about the transatlantic, the slave trade, right? And the journey that enslaved people, because it wasn't a pilgrimage. You know, there's a thing about language and what you do with language in this book. And it's so important for us to use language correctly. So when people speak about an enslaved people, and it's not a pilgrimage to steal people from some place to another place because you are too lazy to labor where you are. There's a thing about the ways in which you write about enslaved people and you bear witness. And so I want to talk about that, what it means to bear witness to a history interrupted, and reimagine what that history may have looked like.
Thank you for that question. Bearing witness for me is the only reason why I'm writing. Like, bearing witness was where I found my purpose, which is to write. I was 6 years old when, well, I was actually 4 years old when my father gave me my first comic book. It was Wonder Woman. And I was so enamored by this character that by age 6, I started rewriting her stories with me in them. And I didn't realize at the time, But looking back at it now, I realized what I was doing was I was putting myself back into a narrative that I did not see myself in. And so when I'm writing the prophets, for example, what I'm doing is bearing witness to put back into the narrative the people who were erased or the people who were lied upon. Because often we see our African ancestors, our enslaved ancestors represented in this literature in a way that is stereotypical, demeaning. And I wanted to ensure that people understood that the institution of slavery is not our sin. It is nothing that we as Black people have to be ashamed of. Who has to be ashamed are the Europeans who invented this enterprise in this particular context in which we were snatched from our loved ones, from our tribes, from our villages, from our families, and brought to labor in some other climate for these people, and in a way that it was our destiny. So we could not, for example, marry into their families and then come out of slavery or what have you. We were, by the color of our skin, marked as inherently sinful and inferior. And so when I witness on behalf of those individuals who, and I know this witnessing is really big in Black Christianity, but it doesn't stem from Christianity. That witnessing is something much older than Christianity that comes from us, from our African traditions that we don't even know because we're disconnected. But those are our African traditions that we have been subsumed by Christianity, by the Christianity that we learned from Europeans. And so part of the reason why the book has such heavy Christian feeling is not because I'm celebrating Christianity, but I'm exposing it for what it was, for what it did, for who it subjugated. And then I'm giving voice to not just the enslaved Africans in America, but the people they came from. Because one of the things that really bothers me about our conversations in contemporary times is the way white supremacy smiles when we're at each other's throats in the African diaspora.
Come on.
They love it.
Speak on it.
They love it when we look at our African cousins and say, y'all think we're inferior, but we're better than y'all. And then they look back and say, we're better than y'all. And then we look at Haitians and say, ugh, y'all, they love that. But this book is my attempt in one small part at a healing for us to recognize that we are not each other's enemy. We are separated by oceans, but we are connected by blood. And that is the witnessing that I'm trying to do here.
Come on. Whew, y'all, you see, we can just go home already because Robert is preaching, okay?
Listen, church is in right now. I hope you have their notes out, their notebooks out. They are reading and taking notes.
I want to speak a little bit about personhood. So you're right. Isaiah didn't know, and he was too tired to ask. But he did think about the ways in which his body wasn't his own, and how that condition showed up uniquely for everyone whose personhood wasn't just disturbed, disputed, but denied, swelling underneath the ways in which not having lawful claim to his own self diminished you, yes, but in another way, condemned those who invented this disconnection. And I think that this is a very important part of what the work of the prophet does, is to let us sit deeply and think about personhood. And although the prophet is set in exposing whiteness and enslavement, what the prophet also does in contemporary writings is that it bears witness to our own denial of personhood, right? This global conversation about the denial of Black people and of queerness, right? And I wanted to speak a little bit about that, right? This whole idea of what does it mean for us? I want to speak about Baldwin here, right? Baldwin says we can disagree and still love each other. unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. And I feel at the heart of that is right what the prophet tries to do, because there's a lot of denial of our personhood in general, but more particularly in the prophets, to the extent of denying people's humanity and right to exist. And I want you to speak a little bit about that.
You know that James Baldwin didn't say that? I
Oh,
actually said it. And people mistakenly believed that it was James Baldwin. And so it has been attributed to Baldwin now for years. But I said it in 2015. And a magazine thought that Son of Baldwin, my online persona, was a James Baldwin tribute account that just posted James Baldwin quotes. So when I posted that, they thought it was a James Baldwin quote, and it has been attributed to him ever since. But I actually said that, and I'm so glad that you bring that up, because that is the message really at the heart of the prophets, is that we can disagree and still love each other unless you are trying to diminish me. You are trying to deny me my right as a human being to exist as I am, because I don't care what your God says. I don't care what your church says. I don't care what your pope, your imam, I don't care what anybody says about my queerness. It is intrinsic to me. And I have the right, as someone who exists, to live free of oppression from you and your dogma. And so when I'm writing about Samuel and Isaiah, or Sarah in particular, I want to make sure that the reader understands that these people are so much more than the identity categories you're trying to place them in. They are human beings, full and dimensional, entitled to freedom and liberation and autonomy, despite whatever rules and regulations you're trying to place on top of them. And there was a time when our ancestors understood this. But because we've been spending so much time trying to be just like the Europeans because they have power, and we want to be like the people who have power, we have forgotten. It is in our blood memory, because we know we feel bad when we're chastising the Black transgender woman, or the Black non-binary person, or the Black queer person. There's something deep inside us that knows that it's wrong, but we do it anyway because we see the white man doing it and we want to be like the white man. But I'm here to remind us that we are not of this pathology. This does not belong to us. This was something that was imposed upon us, and it is up to us to break out of it. And one of the ways we break out of that is we restore the personhood of the people to whom we are paying homage, that we are talking about. So we have Samuel and Isaiah, and we can see them. So I want to give you an example of what Samuel and Isaiah's life would have been like had they not been enslaved. So I give you Kosai and Alewa. And you see King Akusa, this big bash, and she's talking to Brother Gabriel and saying, you don't know what you're talking about. You're puny and you're small, and your way of thinking is unbelievable. But let me show you how great my love is. And let me show you my wives, some of whom are men, some of whom are women, and some of whom are neither, so that you can understand how puny your love is. So that is where this idea of personhood comes in for me. And I find the best examples of it in the pre-colonial, and I hate to call it that, but the African societies before Europe did their nonsense.
I want to link the idea of personhood to a theme that I felt ran throughout the book, and that is the theme of empathy, right? And this idea of humanity. And I think of the scene on page 162, where, without giving away too much, but there's a line where the letters stand Isaiah, but not Samuel. These were people, after all. There was, therefore, some kind of happiness to be found in someone else being humiliated for once. Failure of memory prevented the empathy that should have been natural. Samuel knew though, that it was selective memory, the kind that was cultivated here among the forget-me-nots. And I want to talk about the exploration of this lack of empathy, this lack of humanity, this inability to see each other as a white supremacist construct, right? As a vehicle for white supremacy. And I think that that's something that you explore so deeply in the book, because what people will explore on a superficial level. Oh, we're like crabs in a bucket. We're just always trying to pull each other. And it's such a superficial analysis, right? Because it doesn't speak to really the vehicle that is white supremacy and the ways in which the construction of white supremacy has been so that it denies us the ability to show empathy and humanity towards each other.
In that metaphor you used about crabs in the bucket, Darnell Moore says, when you put crabs in a bucket, of course they're going to pull at each other because they don't belong in a bucket. They belong in the ocean. The problem is the bucket. That is what Darnell Moore says. The problem is the bucket. But yes, I wanted to explore this idea of how we cut ourselves off from not just ourselves, but each other, and the ways in which this system sort of makes sure that that's the way we operate with one another, so that we're never united. It's a divide and conquer strategy that has worked well for centuries, wherever it has been enacted. And it's not just white supremacy, it's also capitalism. It's also patriarchy. It's also any system in which power means dominion over other people, as opposed to empowerment, which is dominion over myself. The ability to have power over just me. We see it, and I tend to think that any person who has power is eventually going to abuse it. That is the nature of power. Because whenever you're seeking to, whether you're a boss at work or you're a parent and have children, whenever it seems that whenever somebody has power over somebody else, they abuse it. So I'm more interested in what power looks like when it's only dominion over myself and ensuring my own autonomy. And I'm not saying that means it's always going to be peaceful, because there are some instances in which I have to defend myself against violence. And I'm not going to just sit there and say, be violent toward me. I'm going to defend myself. So I believe in defensive violence. But it also means, then how do we arrange ourselves as human beings, as a society, in a way in which we do not do that, where we put each other on a hierarchy where, okay, so white people are on top, and then the brown people are in the middle, and then the black people are on the bottom. And now the black people want to put the black queer people on the bottom, and the black queer people want to put the black trans people on the bottom, and then the black trans people want to put the trans non-binary people on the bottom. Like, how do we break out of that is what I'm interested in. And I think where we find that is in naming these systems and then holding each other accountable for perpetuating these systems in whichever way we perpetuate them.
I mean, Robert is just so wise.
Right?
Are you
at the well?
Screaming.
Yeah.
I want to talk about one of the gifts that I think the prophet gives us. One of the gifts that the prophet gives us is this idea of long memory and just genealogy, right? The idea that I think that the prophet in many ways is like redemptive, and it uses long memory as a way of healing the traumas of the past, right? So Alma spoke earlier about this disconnection, right? And I think that in many ways, what the long memory does is that it allows us to sit and go back to Isaiah and Samuel's time and really sit and think about, as you say, the ways in which these people's life would have been different, right? Because I think that in many ways, we think about the prophets as a story that has not been told, and has not been told in the way that it has been told. That in many ways, Samuel and Isaiah's life story is a story that shows us of how we can carve meaning and fashion meaning in places where we're not meant to find meaning. So you have two people who are essentially property, but within this system, they are trying to create meaning for themselves. And I want to speak a little bit about long memory, right? You sort of do a juxtaposition of Isaiah and Samuel and the king, right? And the king's relationships. And what's fascinating for me is just like also this transcontinental, trans-historical understanding of like, in many ways, what you're saying is that we've always been here, right? And the prophet is telling us that we did not need to name and we will not name. So yes, we today in the 21st century can call it queerness, right? But Samuel and Isaiah may not have called it that, but
Right.
we know that, and that's the gift, right? The gift of like this idea of long memory. And I just want you to talk a little bit about that.
I mean, just further to that, sorry, Rob, just further to that, because you've spoken about long memory, something that's interesting for me, you know, in my previous life, I was a practicing doctor, and there was the idea of generational trauma, so that the body remembers. But of course, we always focused on the bad things that the body remembers. And I want to talk about the good things that the body remembers, because there is ritual and there is physical memory and there's physical remembering that is tied to the body remembering. But it's not a generational trauma in the way that we think of what generational trauma is. So there is a transcendence in the way that you think and write about this physical remembering of what your ancestors have done in ways that preceded us. Right? So I just want to add that to the conversation. So the idea of long memory, but also the body as a vehicle to remember that which we may not have written down or spoken of, or that which was stolen from us.
And where I find the origin of that long memory is in African oral tradition. The fact that in the West, we privilege writing things down and scholarly peer review and all of that stuff. But there is a place where the rhythm and the repetition of oral history is vitally important. And that was how our ancestors passed on knowledge, through song and dance, through recitation. This was how we used to do things, and it worked for a very long time. It worked until we were told, "Oh, that's insufficient. That's inferior, a inferior way of doing things." It's filled with flaws, as though when they write things down, it's not flawed, because they once wrote down that we were 3/5 of a person. That was written down, and it's wrong, right? So where the long memory begins is where it's necessary, because in order to have a people whose history is oral, your memory has to be sharp. You have to remember every little detail, every little step, every little turn of the head, and at some point, that becomes instinct. It becomes part of who you understand yourself to be as a person. It becomes, as I refer to it in the prophets, blood memory. And so that, like Dr. Alma talked about how, you know, there's some things that you just remember. My great grandmother and her sisters would do things that we find out later that a tribe in Ghana did. And we were like, how did they do that? Like, where did that come from? That comes from the blood memory. So yes, there's this disconnection between us because of antebellum slavery. The slave trade did horrors to our peoples, so that some of us are on the continent, some of us are in Europe, some of us are in North America, some of us are in South America. But there is something still that connects us, where we're like, we go to Haiti and we have some words that are similar, and we go to Brazil and we have some dances that are similar, and we go to South Africa or Nigeria or Ghana or Kenya, and we realize our rhythms are similar. The way our grandmothers cook are similar. The foods that they privilege are similar. That is where we're connected, and that is the long memory that we don't pay attention to like we should be paying attention to, because it is not just our blood memory, but it's our ancestors trying to tell us, y'all are family. What are you doing? You know, like, don't you see that the enemy loves this disconnection? and love the way that you've pulled yourselves apart and made yourselves so distinct from one another that you don't remember each other's faces anymore. Even though y'all have the same tongue, the same song, the same nourishment, the same parents. So the long memory for me functions as a connector. If slavery is the great disconnection, then long memory is the great connection.
Mm, 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 mm.
I want to talk about, and Letokonolo and I were having a back and forth about this earlier, because Samuel and Desir's relationship is complex, like all relationships are. And Letokonolo and I were talking about silence, and I felt that you demonstrated silence to be a vehicle for intimacy in this book, right? So there were things that were unspoken, right? And things that their environment did not allow them to speak or could not speak in order to protect themselves. But there's a particular way that you use silence as a tool for intimacy in that particular relationship. And I wanted to have your reflections on silence, because Letokonolo and I had back and forth about Isaiah and Samuel, and I mean, when people read the book, they'll realize why this back and forth exists in terms of just the relationship, but also the personalities that mold the relationship. But I am so curious about silence and what it meant in writing the book.
Silence, just like darkness, was the spaces in which love could be magnified. Because if they spoke it, then other people would either want to rend it apart, or would be envious of it, or would chastise them for it, or would want in on it. And we discover that that is what happens when the love is spoken or when the love is seen in the light. But when they have the silence, when they have the dark, that is where they can be their full selves without the gazes of others, without the voices of others, without the sort of judgments of others. And it's also in the silence where memory can function at its most full, because Sarah's braiding Pua's hair and remembering Mary. She doesn't have to say anything, but she's remembering her Mary. Or when Pua is, for example, wondering about Samuel, and she has these feelings for Samuel, she goes to this other place in her head. She doesn't have to say it, because she can find the love that she can't find in the real world. She can find in that other world, in that silent world. And so silence for people who don't have power is a place where they can have power, even if it's fleeting power. They can have themselves back. People who are without power can have themselves back in the dark, oftentimes. So silence for me in the prophets functions as a site of reclaiming oneself, having the personhood that was snatched away from you. You in your silence, you can say all the things you can think all the things you want to the person who is abusing you or to the person who loves you, and they're yours. And that means if they're yours, that means you are something. You exist. You're real. You're a person. You have this autonomy that cannot be taken away. So I really enjoy writing about these things in the silences.
Guys, Robert, it's just wow. It's just.
Thank you.
So Timothy says, I admit, Timothy whispered to him, I have much to learn, but I know this. You are a people. Love is capable. And there is just something so powerful about the prophets that although Isaiah and Samuel are the main people that like we're rooting for and we're hoping that their love flourishes, there are also other pockets of love that shows up. One of my favorite characters in the book is Maggie, because I think that Maggie just gave people the latitude and just a space to be. And Maggie was so loving. You know, you speak about darkness and you speak about silence. Maggie is sort of the first person that invites us to gaze in on the darkness and the silent moments between Samuel and Isaiah. But Maggie holds so much into that, right? Maggie just is just someone who, for me, embodies the spirit of love in the novel. And I wanted to speak a little bit about love and love as an ideological move in the book, to think about how these people are in like a plantation and they've been stripped of their personhood and their humanity. But even then, as Timothy says, you are a people, love is capable. And I want to speak a little bit about that. Just the idea of like how you use love as a form of reclamation of personhood and saying even though we've been stripped because of white supremacy of our personhood, love will still remain something that binds us together.
And love also is a rebellion in this book, right? So you think about in many ways, I felt that Robert was writing against this historical amnesia, but these lies that have been told about how our ancestors did not rebel. And you see, even in love, there's so much rebellion, that even in love, there's reclamation, there's rebellion, that Maggie is often the first site of rebellion in this book, right? In many ways, Maggie back, right? So even the lies that have been told about the ways in which our ancestors did not rebel is not true, right? That our ancestors were not a docile people, that even in the most unspeakable conditions, they rebelled. They were acts of rebellion that we may not have even been able to imagine.
That is absolutely correct. To tackle the first part about the role of love in this novel, what I realized in doing the research for this book was that there was often this unspoken thing. Even in Toni Morrison's Beloved, there is one word that is never uttered, and that's love. Because although the characters feel it intensely for one another, they could never say it for fear of it being snatched away from them. And seeing the prophets, I said, one of the things that I'm going to ensure is that despite whatever else is going on in this world, what these characters are going to have amongst one another, however problematic it might be, is love. So even Amos, for example, the one of the antagonists in the book, he he actually loves Isaiah and Samuel. But he has another conflicting relationship, loving relationship that he's trying to hold on to and protect, that pits him against Samuel and Isaiah, and puts him in this weird sort of middle of the road section. But even he has love. Even Beyonce, who is, I'm not going to spoil it for anybody, but she's doing something that's not so nice. But she's doing it for a reason that she thinks is loving.
Come on, Beulah. Come on, Beulah.
And for Messi.
And then, there's Pua, who is, I think, one of the most vulnerable characters in this story, who everything she does is because she loves this other character, and then, like you say, you have Maggie, whose love is hard. Maggie has a hard love. Her love is not your typical sort of mommy loves you kind of love. Her love is strong and hard, and it is the synonym for truth. Maggie's love is truth. So if she's telling you the truth, she loves you. And that is how our ancestors made it through. That is one of the realizations I came to when I finished this book, when I was reading and writing this book, was they could have only made it through if they had these moments, however fleeting those moments were. Maybe they loved somebody and that person was sold away, or they had a child and that child was taken from them. But the memory of that love, the feeling of it, they held on to, and that is what got them through. And that's how we're here, the three of us, is because something got them through the hatreds, the slavery, the apartheid, whatever it was that our ancestors endured, the love and the idea that one day that love might cover us is what got them through. So that is the first part. Now, what was the second part? There was another part that Dr. Alma asked.
I was speaking about love as rebellion, right? Or rebellion is love.
Oh, you were talking about how there's this idea that the enslaved people or the people, our ancestors, were just docile. Absolutely not. And what I found in the research is that there were hundreds, if not thousands, of rebellions. Not all of them were successful, but they were constantly rebelling in ways large and small against apartheid regime, against antebellum slavery, everywhere around the world, in Canada, in Brazil, in South Africa, wherever there was where we were being oppressed, we were also rebelling. And I wanted to ensure that the chief rebel in this book was a Black woman, because oftentimes Black women are made secondary in these narratives, and in that sort of way, like where it's always Nat Turner or Denmark Vesey or some Black man who is put in charge of the way in which our people rebelled. But I wanted it to be a Black woman, because that happened, and those are the stories that don't get told. It's often the Black women that started on the micro level at first. So they're putting a little something in your food. They're not taking care of the babies that you are making them nurse. They're doing it in these really small ways until it grows, until their frustration is like, I cannot take this anymore, and I'm going to do it outright. So I wanted to ensure that Black women's role in the rebellions was made clear. I know that there are other works by Black women authors who make sure that they show that. But I wanted to also support that idea, to let these Black women writers, and by the way, Black women writers are the best writers on the planet, bar none. So many Yaga Yasi, there's just so many Black women writers who are just absolutely brilliant. But I wanted to show my support of that idea as well.
Speaking of Black women, the women of MC are so interesting. And I think it's so beautiful that they were written into the archive, right? But there's a Black woman in particular that I want to speak to as a vehicle for Black girlhood. And I'm thinking of Pua. Pua in the book, for me, we have not even renewed conversations, but there are constant conversations and excavations around Black girlhood, right? And what it means to be a Black girl in this world. And Pua, in all of her vulnerability, in all of the things that she's subjected to, is the perfect example of what it means to be Black and girl in this world. And I wanted to talk about Pua as a subject for Black girlhood and why, and what it meant for you to write that particular character.
I wrote Pua for all the Black girls in the world who are not allowed to be girls, who are made into women before their time, who are expected to be the strong Black woman all the time, who are not expected to be dainty or vulnerable or smart or cute or funny, or carefree. Pua is the representation of that. I wrote Pua for my sister, my younger sister, Crystal. I wrote Pua for the older women in my family who were made to be women before they were supposed to be. And it was my intention with Pua to ensure she's going to be the one. If anybody on this plantation is going to be untouched by the horrors of rape culture and stuff, even though that's on the periphery, it's going to be Pua, because I want her to have her innocence. I want her to be fully open to this idea about love, to be fully aware of who she was as a girl, and that she was not going to take no shit from nobody, not from her little brother, not from the white girl at the edge of the plantation, nobody. She was going to be her own person, and she was going to choose who she wanted to love. And at the same time be also vulnerable and subject to heartbreak, like any human being. And I got this idea first from reading The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, and how women, black girls, aren't afforded their girlhood, or how their girlhood is always interrupted in some way, and how that interruption is not just the white world outside. It's black adults too who do this. Other black people do this to black girls. And so you see this in the relationship with Pua to Beulah Bianti, how Bianti's angry at Pua for being this innocent little girl, and wants to make her into something else. And sort of in some ways can't wait till, her girlhood is interrupted. And the only person who sees her on this plantation is the one man who only sees her as a friend. Although he's like pressured to do more, he is like, I see you. She knows that he sees her, and that makes her feel whole. And I just wanted to write a character like Pua for the black girls out there who feel that they don't feel like they're never seen as girls.
Pua was healing for me as a black woman. Pua was healing for me in so many ways, because I read Pua and I was like, this is what it may have looked like to have a girlhood not interrupted by people's ideas of what black girls should be, not constrained by people's imaginations of what black women can be. And Pua was such a healing character for me to read as a black woman. I felt like in many ways Pua healed the little girl in me. And I think that's the thing about books, right? Is that you don't know what parts of you need to be healed until you read a Pua and you realize, oh, there's a small girl in me that needed some sort of healing, and Pua was that healing for me.
I wanted to talk about the sex. I want to talk about the sex. I entered into. I just need to read a little part of this because I was shaken. I was shaken. I was a little bit shaken. So this is the first time that we meet Samuel and Isaiah in the darkness and in the silence, right? And you're just like, what's going on, right? Like, wait, hold up. Because I'm sitting at the edge of my book and I'm like, I don't know what these people are going to do. I don't know what's happening. And then it happens, right?
Right up front.
And I'm like, yes, Robert, yes. Because, because I want to say this. I think that it's important to talk about the sex and talk about the sex as ordinary. Because as queer people, our sex is often looked upon as if it's different, it's abnormal, it's messy, and there's always frills around the way that us as queer people have sex. And for me, it was really refreshing and deeply healing and also exciting to enter a book where our sex was not they got under the carpet and then they got under the sheets, they fucked, and then they had sex, right? There was an intimacy in which you write the sex scenes in this book. The way we see Samuel look at Isaiah and the way Isaiah looks at Samuel. I kind of want to be in on that, I just want to be like, okay, hold up, like this is a little bit intimate. I want in. But I want to speak about that, writing about our interior lives as queer people as if they matter, because they do. And writing about why it was important for you to enter the sex and to enter the book in the way that you did.
It was crucial that I not shy away from their queerness, their love, which means their sex. Samuel and Isaiah are in love since they were boys. They didn't know when they were boys what these feelings meant, because they had no context for what they were feeling until they reach puberty, and then they start to understand what they're feeling for one another. But these are people who have been having sex for some time and know exactly what the other person likes, knows the contours of the other person's body, knows the heat of it, knows the feel of it, where each hair lies. And so they know the moisture. And so I wanted to make sure that when I was writing about their lovemaking, that it did feel both ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. That it was something that they could not wait to do, that they knew exactly where to go and what to do when it happened, and that they enjoyed the act of it, even in the midst of all the degradation around them. This was their moment of reprieve, of safe space, of joy, that they got to worship each other's bodies in a way that their bodies deserved to be worshipped. And I wanted that to be true of any of the sexual acts between any of the characters in the book, if they were engaging in consensual sexual activity, that is, that there was a beauty and a sort of sly, sort of not, I don't want to call it sinfulness, but I wanted to be a little bit dirty, because that's lust. Lust is good too. Lust
A
is
little
not lust is not a bad thing. In America, we have this European puritanical sense about sex, that it always has to be, missionary position and all this other stuff. So many people don't understand that women have a G-spot, and so do men, and so do others. So do non-binary people and asexual people, and people who have both genitals or different sorts of genitals. They have G-spots, and we've been taught that touching those things or pleasuring those things is dirty. But no, touching those things and pleasuring those things is beautiful, and it makes you feel good, and it should. And I wanted to make sure that those things came across, particularly when I was writing about Samuel and Isaiah.
So Robert writes, Isaiah scooted over until their bodies touched. The spot where their shoulders met grew moist. Their feet rubbed together. Samuel didn't know why, but he began to tremble, which made him angry because it made him feel exposed. Isaiah didn't see the anger. Instead, he saw the beckoning. He rose to move on top of Samuel, who flinched a bit before relaxing. Isaiah slid his tongue slowly and gently over Samuel's nipple, which came to life in his mouth. Both of them moaned. It was different from the first kiss. How many seasons ago was that now? 16 or more? It was easier to count those than the moons, which sometimes didn't show up because it could have been temperamental like that. Isaiah remembered that it was when the apples had been fuller and redder that they had never been before or since, where they stumbled and shame had kept them both from looking in each other's eyes. Now, Isaiah moved in close and let his lips linger on Samuel's. Samuel recoiled only a little. His uncertainty had found cover beneath repetition. Their struggle had once made him want to choke Isaiah as much as his own self was in remission. There was only traces of it now, insignificant battles in the far corners of his eyes, maybe a smidgen at the back of his throat, but it was overcome by other things. They didn't give each other the chance to fully disrobe. Isaiah's pants were down around his knees, Samuel dangling from his ankle, impatient, thrusting into each other in a haystack, the moonlight shining dimly on Isaiah's ass and Samuel's soles. They rocked. And when I read that, I was like, I mean, yes. Can we just have some dignity, right? I absolutely loved the intimate ways in which the consensual lovemaking in this book was created. Because as you say, right, you wanted to, the tenderness, every little spot, every little moment, it felt like, it was so important to write about this sex in a way that was meaningful, even for the people who are participating in it.
Yes.
I wanted to also talk a little bit about, I think what the prophet does is really academia. The prophet does really theoretical queer theory in ways that we can't imagine. I think particularly about Professor Brittany Cooper, who writes in her book, and I think about Professor Christina Sharp, who speak about care work and speak about the way in which thoughtfulness and writing about our lives should be care work. I want to speak a little bit about the prophets as that type of care work. I think that more than anything, the prophets really what it does is that it does a lot of care work. And why it was important for you to write the prophets in the manner that you did, to care for the people in the way that you did.
It was extremely important, particularly for the Black characters in the book, that I didn't want to deify them and make them seem so pure and innocent as possible, but I did want to give them their full humanity in a way in which they're permitted their flaws, they're permitted their disagreements, but none of that stripped them of their human beingness. So the care work for me was ensuring, if I'm going to write about this Black queer character, I want to get him right. If I'm going to write about these Black women, I want to get them right. If I write about King Akusa from a time immemorial on a continent that my ancestors were taking from, I want to get her right. And so what that kind of care requires is that you do your research, that you listen, and that you are as observant as you possibly can be of other people, to ensure that if you don't get it all 100% correct, the core of it at least is pointing toward honesty. And that is, for me, care work and honesty mean the same exact thing. And that was the most important thing for me in writing this book, was even though the Kasongo people that I write about are a fictional people, I am drawing upon real life sources to give us a fuller picture of what pre-colonial African societies functioned like, and what their thoughts were like. Because so often we think things like, oh, they were an ancient people, they were so primitive. But what I have come to discover was, we're the primitive ones. They were advanced. And all of the research bears this out. The way they thought about gender roles and gender and sexuality is so advanced. We're just now beginning to get to where they were thousands of years ago. So who's really primitive? So yeah, that's the care work for me.
I want to talk about hope, right? I think that there is this story, although we are speaking about enslaved people who are subjected to degradation and have so much taken and stolen from them, right? There is a hopeful nature in this book, and there's something about the ways in which people hold on to hope in this book that doesn't feel like, you often get told, just be hopeful, just be strong. You'll get through it, okay? And there's a falseness in that kind of hopefulness, but there is an honesty and tenderness with which you bring us to hopefulness in this book. And I want to talk about why it was important for you to end this book with hopefulness.
I think about James Baldwin in this conversation, because James Baldwin was asked if he was an optimist or a pessimist. And he said, well, I have to be an optimist, because what do I tell the children? And that is sort of the place that I found myself left in, was, if I'm saying that all hope is lost and there's no point, what will the children get from that message? What do they become when they think that there is no point? We see what children become when they think that there is no point, when you look at what the children of apartheid do. These are the children of the parents who started and the grandchildren of the people who started apartheid. And look at what they're doing in South Africa today. You see hopelessness when you look at this country, the United States, and you see a young white boy go into a kindergarten classroom and shoot up all the children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is what happens when you're told hopelessness. So I could not bear to be an artist and to say that there's no point. And I know Afro pessimism might push me into saying maybe there is no point, that Blackness is a trap, and that as long as white supremacy exists, Black people will be menaced. And that might be true. But I want to leave room for the possibility that we could actually end white supremacy and end supremacy of any kind. And so that is not going to look organized and orderly. That's going to be very chaotic and messy.
Mm-hmm.
And that is sort of what we get at the end of the prophets, is that in the chapter Exodus, there's that sort of this chaotic, messy rebellion happening. And we're not sure how some of the characters that we've come to love, we're not really 100% sure what happens to them. We're hoping that they're okay, but we don't know for sure. And that is how revolution sort of works. We don't know what happens after. We have to build what happens after. We have to struggle to bring what we want to happen. And so that is the hope work. That is the optimism at the end, but also at the core of the prophets.
Oh, I love what you've just said. I mean, I just read Toni Onyebuchi's Riot Baby, right? And even that, I felt like did something similar to this, and there is a call for the reimagination of who we could be outside of who we are, and outside of the confines of what we find ourselves to be. There's this call to, and reimagination is hope work. It's powerful work. It's rebellious work as well. And I think that there is just something so beautiful about the ways in which you've called on us to reimagine who we may have been without interruption, but who we can be in the future if we shake off these constraints of imagination and of being that we've so tightly held on to.
What a absolutely wonderful conversation. I mean, we can go for hours and hours because there is so much to unpack. But this was really just a taster for us to introduce our listeners and our readers here in South Africa and across the world. Just really that the prophet is something that you have to have on your bookshelf. It's not like a negotiable. It's not like I'm gonna think about it. It's just like, no. Like, get it today. So before we rush off, what we want to do is just give about 5 minutes or 10 minutes an opportunity for anyone who has questions and also comments, feedback that you want to give to Robert. We'll put it up on this screen so that Robert can see it and we'll read it and ask the question. So please, from wherever you are, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, please ask questions, praises. I just want to share some of the things that have been said here. So Kabelo on Twitter says this conversation has me shaken by all the truths and facts. And then Winey earlier had said, I'm enamored even before reading the book. And we see Panashe Chukumadzi is joining us, and she says yes to long memory. And then Kabelo's also said, this is definitely my selection for my book club. I need them to see this magic. So we're really grateful for that. So we'll just wait to see if anyone has any questions. But what I wanted to say was, I kept reading the prophets and thinking about June Jordan. And June Jordan says, the motivation behind every sentence is the wish to say something real to someone real. And I think that's at the heart of the prophets for me, that the book you wrote wasn't fictional in a sense that you were creating a make-believe world, but you were saying the only way in which I can convey this message is through this form. But I hope that I'm speaking something real to someone real. And from the really bottom of my heart, thank you, Robert, for seeing us in the many ways that you've seen us. And thank you for also listening and taking heed to being tasked with this ancestral witnessing to bring forth the prophets. I don't think that people who take seriously memory and just wanting to do better are going to be the same once they've finished reading the prophets. I think that the prophets is really like it does a lot and meaningful work. So thank you so much for that.
Thank
It
you.
actually makes me think of Gwendolyn Brooks, the quotes where she says, "We each other's harvest, we are each other's business, we are each other's magnitude and bond." And I think
yes.
you cannot read the prophets and not think of Gwendolyn Brooks saying that we are each other's harvest, right? That we are each other's magnitude and bond. And I don't even have my English is depleted. You know? my bundles are just depleted, but that we are each other's magnitude and bond. And I don't think that you can read the prophets and not walk away believing that we are each other's harvest.
Oh.
There's a question here from Hope, who wants to know how difficult or easy it was to give birth to this book.
It was difficult because there was so much research that I had to do. But beyond the research, I also had so much fear about how it would be received, that people might not like it, that they might not like the subject matter. I'm not sure if people know, it took me 14 years to write this novel. 14 years to write this book because other than the fact that life interrupts and I had to sort of work full time and then write whenever I had time, I was also just trying to be a better writer as I was writing this book and trying to be as faithful and honest as I possibly could about these characters and the subjects that I was speaking of. So it was quite difficult, but it's the good work is always difficult work.
Any other questions before we let Robert go?
Unquotables. Okay, I'm gonna rewatch this and just take notes.
So, Cabello asked, what new stories has the research into the book inspired?
You know, I am 40 pages into a second novel. People have asked, am I writing a sequel or prequel to the Prophets? This next novel will not be a sequel or prequel to the Prophets. I don't know if I can write a sequel or prequel to the Prophets, but I do know that King Akusa will not let me go. So maybe one day, I'm not sure. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, King Akusa.
That is everything.
King Akusa. I mean, look, there are many reasons why you have to read the prophets. And one of the reasons is that Robert writes, okay?
Yeah.
Like, hey, you're just sitting there and you're like, oh, hold up, let me read that sentence again.
Yeah. I was highlighting sentences. I ran out of page markers because I realized I was highlighting sentences.
I mean, just listen to this, right? But being soft while beautiful on its own was subject to being torn asunder by the harder thing. What other answer was there then but to be some kind of flexible? Stretch farther so that there is too much difficulty in trying to pull you apart. I don't highlight, I don't write in my books. I just think a book is sacred and I did that. I was like, hold up, but being soft while beautiful on its own was subject to being torn asunder by a harder thing. So y'all, I just want to say, read the book because it's magical in every sense, right? But the writing in this book is so rich. Like, it's just like, I will return to the book so many times because I just enjoy just how beautiful like these sentences are put together.
That was very nice. I'm like so touched by that.
We just want to once again extend our gratitude to Robert you know that this work is hard work, right? There is something about excavating these stories out of memory, out of blood, and putting them on page to write against the historical, to write into the archive, but to write against the amnesia that exists. And there is something so powerful and so revolutionary about doing that. And I think that we just want to give you your flowers. We want to let you know that we cannot wait to see what else this book brings about, because I don't think that you can read the prophets and walk out of it the same, or think the same, or have the same imagination. And I'm so grateful for the work that you've done and continue to do. And I think that it's so important to receive your flowers all the way from South Africa, but to know that this is a transcontinental love letter to you that we are expressing, but also to know that there is a connection outside of the diaspora, which has been created as an artificial creation, as a construct, but that there is a blood relation that is found in stories like this, and that we return.
Okay, we're back. You know, white supremacy is trying to hold us down, but we're back. We're back.
It's the misogynoir. It is all of it. Black speaking.
Yes.
It is all of it, but we speak against it. We come against it.
One, just again, Robert, to say from the Cheeky Natives, thank you so much for the prophets, and thank you so much for the generosity of your time this your afternoon, our evening. We really appreciate it. To anyone who's interested in buying the prophets, please say and we will get the book to you. So just send us an email to say you'd like to order the book, and then we will make sure that it arrives at your doorstep. And thank you everyone for joining us. Again, thank you, Robert, so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. This has been such a wonderful conversation. You feel like family to me now. So now you are my cousins. I just have to let you know. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Bye, everyone.